I'm Larry Vickers, the host of TAC-TV. I'm a trained firearms professional with years of experience in the industry. So unless you're properly trained, never attempt anything you see on this show, ever. Welcome TAC-TV fans to Obendorf, Germany, home of the world-famous Heckler Koch tactical firearms manufacturer. They happen to be a sponsor of this show, and they're very secretive about their manufacturing facility. We don't want to give away any industry secrets, so we're not going to take you behind those doors, but we are going to take you to the nearby Obendorf Weapons Museum to show you the history of Mauser and how that led to the HK that we know today. It all started here at the Mauser Works in Obendorf in the Neckar Valley and in the southern part of Germany. This at one time was probably the most famous arms manufacturer in Europe, and certainly the guns they designed and fabricated later had a great impact on the conflicts of both World War I and World War II. Now, Mauser's made a wide variety of products over the years, but in my opinion, their most famous, without a doubt, would be the K98K bolt-action rifle of World War II fame. Now, at the beginning of the war, it started out at almost commercial standard, walnut, polished metal, far beyond what the Wehrmacht needed to invade Russia or France. Now, later in the war, it was simplified into what we call the Kriegs model, had laminated wood, many of the frills were gone, and the finish was more of a basic Parkerized style finish. However, the fabrication techniques were largely the same. It was made out of wood and forged steel. And no conversation about Mauser or even H&K can take place without referring back to the Mauser 98, and specifically, in my opinion, the K98K, which was the variant of the Mauser 98 used by the Wehrmacht in World War II. Now remember, the German Army used the Gewehr 98, which was a longer variant of this particular weapon in World War I. They made some modifications, shortened it, they modified the cartridge, and they essentially adapted the Gewehr 98 into what we call the K98K, a carbine variant or a shortened version of the Gewehr 98. A lot of the parts interchange, and the way it operates is essentially the same. Now, this is a 1936 K98K, and it's an S-42 coated gun. The Germans, because of the Treaty of Versailles, they had to kind of mask their rearmament after Hitler took power in 1933, and then later they had to mask where the guns were being made because of Allied bombing. This is an S-42 gun. That happens to be a BYF-45 gun. Both of them were made by Mauser. And Mauser wasn't the only manufacturer of the K98 and K in World War II. There were several others. Even as large as Mauser is, they could not make the number of rifles that the Wehrmacht needed. This gun is essentially made to commercial standards of the time. It's made in 1936, blued finish, polished. All the parts, by and large, are machined out of forgings, walnut stock, and almost all the parts are serial number matching, going down to the floor plate assembly and even the screws that hold it in place. Now, if we go over here, we have a 1945 made Mauser K98K. It's a BYF-45 coated gun. If you contrast the two, big differences between how this gun was made prior to the war and how this gun was made in the very last months of the war. Essentially has a laminated or a plywood stock. The Germans found that this style butt plate allowed the stock to be chipped and worn, so they went to a cup style butt plate fairly early in the war. This has a hooded front sight, where this one has a standard front sight with a spring-loaded hood that allows it to flap open and fire around. The problem here is this has to be pushed in, rotated in order to be taken off and allow the soldier to see the sight picture. They found out real early on in the war this was not a bad idea, so the hooded front sight came into service in the early 40s. Also, this has a lot of stamped sheet metal going on. The floor plate stamped sheet metal as well as the butt plate, but also you have a barrel band up front, stamped sheet metal on the hood, and even the front sling swivel is stamped sheet metal. They've done away with the bayonet lug. They've also done away with the cleaning rod. Very few parts on this match or have the same serial number, mostly just the major components, and they've done away with the need to have all the small components serial number matching. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the effort it took to build this gun to this one, it was much more labor intensive than the Germans could afford at that point in the game. Okay, the basis to these guns is essentially the two-lug rotating bolt, the manual rotating bolt of the 98 Mauser design. It has a controlled feed function, which means as you start to push it forward, the extractor slides up underneath the case rim and controls it all the way into the chamber. It's one of the reasons why this action is still preferred for hunters. So in case they're overseas and they have to manually extract around, or they won't have feed stoppages because of that controlled feed. It's such a good action that our Springfield, 03 Springfield, was essentially a copy of this, an unlicensed copy the United States blatantly ripped off. It's been said that the Springfield 03 was probably the best target range bolt action rifle ever made. This is probably the best hunting bolt action rifle ever made, and the Lee Enfield was probably the best combat bolt action rifle ever made. I would essentially say that's true. Bottom line, the action with this gun, 1936 Mauser, 1945 Mauser, essentially the same. By and large, all the parts interchange between that gun and this gun. Okay, the Germans went to World War I with a cutting-edge battle rifle, the Gewehr 98. They went to World War II, they were a little bit behind the power curve, frankly. They had the K98K, but they were not the only major country to be fielding a bolt-action rifle at that time. Great Britain, Russia, Japan, essentially were fielding bolt-action battle rifles. The United States was the one country that was able to field a semi-automatic battle rifle in large numbers and leapfrog guns like this K98K. So by the time the United States got to continental Europe, we were up against K98Ks, we had a distinct edge. By 1945, the writing was on the wall. The M1 Garand that we loved was made obsolete by the Sturm Giver. Okay, the legendary Sturm Giver set the stage for what Mauser came up with next. Although it was not a Mauser design, they took a page out of its book with the stamped sheet metal and developed their own delayed blowback roller lock system. This was known as the Sturm Giver 45, and a very limited number of prototypes were made at the very end of the war. That gun was taken to Spain by some Mauser engineers and former employees, was developed into the SETME, and then later came back and became the G3 for the German Army after World War II. HK made over 3 million G3s, not only for the German Army, but for sales all around the world to different militaries. And it became the basis for an entire family of small arms in 5.56 as well as 9mm, the world famous MP5. Now, to understand how the G3 operates, or all the roller-locked HK weapons, you need to think of them more as half-locked. It's delayed blowback, but if it was fully locked with the rollers, it wouldn't cycle. So essentially, it locks up the system long enough to allow the bullet to exit the muzzle and pressures to drop to a safe level before it extracts and ejects the cartridge. It can be rather violent, and one of the things that HK developed over the years to help soften the process and not rip off case heads is flutes in the chamber. Allows actually the case to somewhat float off the chamber walls and allows for more positive and safe extraction. One of the most important developments that came out of World War II was the use of stamped sheet metal in weapons like the MG42 and the Sturm Giver. Mauser developed that, and then HK picked it up and of course used it with the G3. This is an example of how a template of stamped sheet steel is turned into a G3 receiver. Now, HK made an entire family of weapons off this style receiver, and now recently HK's made the change away from stamped sheet metal more in the area of polymer. A good example of that is the HK G36 and the UMP, as well as the MP7. This is a polymer or plastic receiver which has metal inserted in key spots, which keeps it easy to fabricate. You can fabricate it in different colors, and it's very lightweight. This is clearly the path forward, and HK's been leading in this direction for quite some time. All right, fans, time to hit the range and fire up some of these long guns. Okay, if you happen to be a fan of my tactical firearms related shows over the years, you know this is one of my favorites, the Sturm Giver. Now, it's not a Mauser design, but Mauser certainly took notes from it. And it kind of showed the path forward on how Mauser and then H&K were going to fabricate their weapons. The story behind it is very interesting. The Germans fielded the MP38 and the MP40 in 9mm Parabellum submachine guns with this cartridge right here, and it was effective out to say 50 or 100 meters or so. They also fielded the K98K bolt action rifle, which chambered in 8mm Mauser was effective for a long distance, 800 to even 1,000 yards. Well, they studied their typical combat engagement distances, and they found out that in fact this was underpowered and this was overpowered. They needed something that bridged the gap because in most cases they were engaging the enemy within 300 meters. That's where this gun came in. They could make a much smaller, more compact package that was also controllable and fully automatic. 8mm Mauser on a shoulder-fired weapon is virtually uncontrollable and worthless in fully automatic. This gun in 7.92 Kurs, or 8mm short, is very controllable. Also, the way this gun was fabricated was revolutionary at the time. It's stamped sheet metal, folded, pinched, and riveted to a trunnion that the bolt carrier group locks into. Now, it's gas operated, so they have to index the barrel to the trunnion and tap the barrel to siphon off gas. But the stamped sheet metal acts as a housing for the trigger mechanism and to also allow the bolt carrier group to reciprocate in. Now, this gun was so revolutionary, it made essentially all other shoulder-fired small arms obsolete by the end of the war. Many countries took note, and especially the Russians. They were the first major country to field their version of the Sturm Giver in the AK-47. Now, as this gun went forward, Mauser developed their own version of it, which then later after the war turned into the German Army G3, which was the battle rifle that Germany and many other countries used for many decades, and it was primarily manufactured by H&K. All right, now before we start talking about the G3, which is really the weapon that put HK on the map, we got to talk about the Sturm Giver 45. They only made a handful of prototypes before the war ended. Those guns were captured by the Allies, of course, as they overran the factory. Now, a lot of our allies, such as Great Britain, wanted an intermediate cartridge along the assault rifle format, but the United States was going to hear none of that. Essentially ramrodded what we now know as 7.62 NATO, a shortened 30-06. So guns like the Sturm Giver 45 had to turn into guns like the G3. They had to grow to accept the bigger caliber, so guns like the G3 or the FNFAL are essentially 30 calibered assault rifles. That's why in fully automatic, they're all but worthless. Okay, now remember, the G3 carries over the stamped sheet metal concept that it got from the Sturm Giver. As a matter of fact, this is one of the stampings right here for the receiver. You see this is the ejection port window that you see on this side of the gun. It's folded, pinched, and riveted around the trunnion. Now, one of the things this brings to the table over, say, the World War II Sturm Giver is, it doesn't require an indexed barrel. You don't have to drill a gas port in the barrel. You simply screw it into the trunnion and you're ready to go. But it has a few unique features that didn't transfer over from the Sturm Giver 45. One, has a flash suppressor. In World War II, the Sturm Giver didn't have one. Also, the Germans finally got away from the tangent sight setup like they had on the K98 and the Sturm Giver. They have diopter sights and an aperture, a much better sighting arrangement. Also, they have the ability to mount optics much easier, which if you go to the K98 or the STG 45, they really didn't have that feature. They took the push pin concept for attaching the buttstock and took it to the next step. They made it so where the trigger mechanism was able to be push pinned off, unlike the World War II German Sturm Giver. G3 is a very rugged, reliable gun, and in the United States, when we think of H&K, we think of the MP5. Around the world, in many cases, the most popular HK gun of all time is G3. Stay tuned, because coming up next, we're going to delve deeper into the history of Mauser and also look at some of the manufacturing techniques that HK uses for building their firearms. It's time for your Daniel Defense training tip, and this one's all about the dime drill. This is a classic sight alignment and trigger control drill from way back in the day, and it involves putting a dime on your barrel, aligning it on the target, and squeezing the trigger so you don't drop the dime. Now, there's an alternate method to this where you have a cleaning rod extended way out on the end. And I'm going to show you the version that, if you're careful, you can do by yourself. Make sure your weapon's clear. Cock the action, put it on safe. Align it in the general direction of your target and very carefully put the dime on the top of your barrel. Get into position, line up your sights and squeeze the trigger. Now if you do it right, it won't drop off the end of the barrel. At this point, slowly cycle your action. Now you can get back on target and do it again. Repeat that procedure as long as you want, and you can also use it with different positions. Now remember, at the end of the day, this is all about getting you in the right frame of mind about sight alignment and trigger control, because bottom line, in the real world, only hits count. One of the most innovative small arms the world has ever known is the HK G11, which was a caseless assault rifle which was intended to replace the G3. It had a polymer frame with metal parts inside and a highly proprietary, sophisticated operating system, which ultimately was doomed to failure. Now later on, HK developed a weapon that became the G36, which in fact did replace the G3 in the German military, and it was a dramatically different design from the G11 or the G3. The G36 is gas operated, has a multi-lug rotating bolt like an M16, and in fact adopts the operating mechanism from the Armalite AR-18 into a polymer housing. It's currently used by the German government as their standard service rifle for their military to this day. Okay, the next HK long gun that we need to talk about is the G36. Now let me give you a little bit of history here. HK G3 was essentially a post-war development of the Sturm Giver 45, and it was chambered in 7.62 NATO. It was fielded by the German government and many other nations for many, many years. Now, when 223 Remington came on the scene with the US M16 and there was a push for NATO standardization, HK had a lineup of roller-locked guns in that caliber. The problem is, for whatever reason, the roller locking mechanism, like using the G3, has never done very well in 5.56. So after the G11 effort failed, unfortunately, that was a caseless design that HK was developing for the German government, and the German government can no longer afford it with the East-West reunification. They had to kind of go back to the drawing board and came up with a gas-operated multi-lug rotating bolt design that they housed in polymer instead of stamped sheet metal, and it became the G36. Now, the basic operating mechanism was based off the Stoner AR-18, and even though that gun was a failure, it has spawned many other successful designs like the G36. For instance, the operating mechanism in this, the bolt-and-bolt carrier, are almost identical to the ones used in the FN SCAR, so obviously FN took notes off the G36 and the reliability this gun brings to the table. HK also formatted the G36 and the XM8, which was the ill-fated attempt to field a replacement to the M4 and M16 in US service, and recently the Magpul Masada, now known as the Bushmaster ACR, is essentially the G36 in a different format. The G36 has proven to be a very reliable platform and has been the mainstay of the HK 5.56 lineup for many years, and I'm sure that will continue for many years to come. All right, it's time to head back to the museum and check out some of the world-famous Mauser and HK weapons displayed there. One tradition that HK has carried on that they inherited from Mauser was not only developing world-class long guns, but world-class handguns. In fact, the first auto-loading pistol, the most successful one that we trace back to, is the Broom-Handle Mauser. Interesting thing about the Broom-Handle Mauser, very well made. It only had one screw in the entire weapon, the screw that held the grip panels together. The C96 Broom-Handle Mauser handgun. Very famous handgun, extremely well made, brought into production in 1896 and widely considered to be the first successful auto-loading handgun that was widely available. Individuals like Winston Churchill were very fond of the design, and also this weapon is so futuristic, even to this day it was used in the Star Wars movies for Han Solo's blaster. One of the interesting things about the Broom-Handle Mauser, it has no screws whatsoever other than the screw that holds the two grip panels together. You can see the shape, that's where the name Broom-Handle comes from. The stock also doubles as a holster, and the rear sight's graduated all the way out to 1,000 meters, which for a 9mm or a 7.63 Mauser handgun is very overly optimistic. This set the stage for the Luger that followed with Mauser, but the seeds to the handgun engineering expertise that we see in HK today all started way back in the late 1800s in Mauser and Obendorf. The Broom-Handle Mauser has an internal box magazine. This particular one holds 10 rounds and has to be fed through the top with a stripper clip. Now I can tell you from personal experience, it's almost impossible to load this pistol one round at a time. It more or less forces you to use a stripper clip to load it. Also, it's a single action weapon. The hammer cocked, it fires from that mode, and you have to cam it back slightly in order to put it on safe. Very unique design. It's more or less the first successful handgun that was chambered in 9mm parabellum, which later became the NATO standard in 9x19. HK carried on their tradition of handguns directly from Mauser, and in fact, their very first handgun, the HK4, was clearly influenced by the Mauser HSC. The Mauser innovation was carried on. HK made the very first polymer frame handgun, the VP70Z, which was a semi-automatic version of the VP70 machine pistol. They even had a roller lock gun along the lines of the Sturm Giver 45 or the G3. As time went on, one of the things they did was continued down the polymer line and made a wide variety of polymer handguns, as well as an all-metal squeeze cocker P7 that actually used a gas-delayed blowback action. HK is one of the most famous handgun manufacturers anywhere in the world, and this is just a sampling of some of the handguns they've made over the last few decades. Their very first handgun was the HK4. It was available in a variety of calibers, and it's based off the Mauser HSC design. This one's chambered in 9mm Kurz, also known as 380. It's no longer manufactured, so it's a collector's item. This is the P9S. This is another gun that uses a stamped sheet metal slide, but it also has the roller locking mechanism like it's used in the G3 or MG42 or Sturm Guevara 45. Very interesting gun, very accurate, also no longer made, so it's a collector's item. HK P7, this is the famous squeeze cocker. It's a striker fired weapon, very controllable, very accurate, and has an excellent trigger. It has a gas-delayed blowback. It's essentially a piston-operated gun, for lack of a better term. Gas is siphoned off in front of the chamber, goes down into a tube, and a piston delays the slide from unlocking. It's considered delayed blowback because of that. No longer manufactured. In many ways, the most famous of all HK handguns and the most labor-intensive to make. Now, HK has the distinction of being the first major manufacturer to make a polymer frame handgun. The P9S itself had a stamped sheet metal frame with polymer wrapped around it, but the VP70Z, which is a semi-automatic variant of the VP70 machine pistol, is considered to be the first widely available polymer frame handgun on the market. Now, HK moved away from the Mauser-inspired handgun designs when they went to the USP. It has a polymer frame like the VP70Z did. However, it uses the Browning tilting barrel locking mechanism as seen in the 1911 and the Browning High Power. It's available in a variety of calibers and a variety of trigger mechanisms in that modularity approach that HK is famous for. As a matter of fact, the latest and greatest variant is the HK45 Compact, which is also known as the Mark 24 in US service within SOCOM. It uses an AAC suppressor with an extended magazine, and it's meant to replace the Mark 23 in US service. As a matter of fact, at least one of these was carried on Operation Neptune Spear, the mission to kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. When it comes to HK handguns, it started back here with the HK4, inspired by the Mauser HSC. Now you're all the way down on this end with the HK45 Compact. This is a gun that I was involved with the development of. It meets the needs of special operations. It runs suppressed, accurate and reliable and durable over many thousands of rounds. Because of this, you see HK in the holsters of many special operations soldiers around the world. HK is world famous for their military small arms, and in fact, they've been used in some of the most significant special operations missions during the global war on terror. But you really can't understand HK until you see where they came from and their history that ties back to Mauser. And I'm really glad I was able to take you, the viewers of TAC-TV, over to check out the museum. This is Larry Vickers signing off from Obendorf, Germany, on another episode of TAC-TV.